Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Coping with Crisis series. And we decided to do something like this in more of a counseling path because of all the things that are hitting us as believers during this shutdown of our society and shutdown of the churches and whatnot. And so, what we've seen with this time, that period we're in, is that it's kickstarting a lot of things that have been in people, bringing up old wounds. People are getting tense. People are getting, a lot of things thrown at them, like stress and anxiety, not knowing where this time is going. And then also, if you look at from a prophetic standpoint, you can kind of see the telltale signs of where a lot of this is going, obviously, and sometimes that's pretty scary and causes some stress and anxiety. So we've been doing this series to help people learn how to cope with the times they're in. And so the topic we're going to deal with is depression today, because a lot of people have become depressed from what's been going on in this shutdown. Life has virtually stopped for a lot of people, and life as normal has stopped, and it doesn't appear that there's anything going to happen anytime soon to get back to normal. And in fact, it appears that we may never get back to what we were before all of this happened. And so dealing with this new normal is going to take a challenge and some adaptability to be able to cope with what's going on. So what I have noticed since March till now is a lot of people have become depressed. A lot of people don't even know they're depressed, but when I talk to them, I'm seeing all the signs of depression. And just let me make a disclaimer before we go any further about depression. This video that we're making about depression is not providing you a medical diagnosis or prescriptive advice or a substitute for going to your doctor or whoever you go to, your healthcare provider. So I want you to understand that first of all. If you're taking prescription medications or you really want to change what's happening in your life, you need to go see a medical professional that has the appropriate expertise. What we're trying to do is touch on the subject and be able to say, hey, the feelings that you might have might be linked to depression, and if so, maybe you do need to go talk to somebody. Maybe you need to go talk to a counselor. Maybe you do need to talk to a doctor. Because unfortunately, so many people are carrying depression, but they are in denial of it, or they don't recognize it. And so we want to point those things out. So if you do have some symptoms or whatnot, then you go see your medical provider for it, or your counselor, or whoever you go to talk about things like that. So anyway, I want to put that disclaimer out. The second thing I want to say about depression is there's been a stigma attached to depression, and this goes back years and years and years. But a lot of Christians who get depressed feel a lot of shame and guilt over it because they think, well, I should be more spiritual, I shouldn't think like this, I shouldn't feel like this, and apparently, they start saying, I lack faith, or some person who doesn't know how to deal with depression tells them, well, you just got to have more faith. And so they feel shame and guilt over that, or feeling this way. We shouldn't stigmatize depression with shame and guilt. It can happen to anybody. Some of the biblical characters experienced depression, like King David, even Moses, and some of these other biblical characters. Moses wanted to die. He asked God to take his life. I mean, that's a sign of depression, that he's feeling hopeless. He has no way out. And other biblical characters, too, felt the same way. A lot of the great preachers of yesteryear dealt with depression. A lot of them couldn't get out of bed for days. A lot of them had to actually leave their pulpit in the wintertime because the winter was so depressing. They had to leave the area where they were at and go to a more sunnier place. And they would take maybe a 2 or 3 month hiatus to get themselves back to normal. So a lot of the great Christians throughout the history have suffered with depression and have dealt with it. And so it's not uncommon, and you shouldn't feel any shame and guilt if you're having to deal with it as well. Well, the Bible does address depression. And so that's the good news. It talks about this and it shows you that. And what we're starting to see now is because of all the stresses and anxiety that people are dealing with, especially in this lockdown, and people have lost their jobs, and people have lack of income and things, that causes depression a lot of times. But a lot of times they don't know it, or they deny it, or they spiritualize it. A lot of people spiritualize it. And the idea of spiritualizing it has to do with, well, I just lack faith, and I need to pray more, I need to read my Bible more, and go to more Bible studies. And they do that, and depression still stays. And so they think there's something wrong in their spiritual life, when really it's not so much that, it's what's happening to them. And they need to address that other issue. And address it from a biblical standpoint, no doubt about that. But, to say, well, I just lack faith, or I just don't know enough, that's not going to solve the problem. And also, people have prayed and prayed and prayed, and God does answer prayer, no doubt about it. But they pray for this affliction to lift them, and it doesn't. And there's a reason God doesn't do that. He wants them to fix it. He wants them to change their thinking. They might have to go to a doctor or whatnot. So a lot of times, God is not answering that prayer because He wants them to use the tools He's provided to get out of that depression. So it's not like God wants someone in depression. He just tells them, use the tools I gave you, and you can get out of it. When a person starts having depression, again, they might not even realize it, but if it goes untreated, if it goes unaddressed, if it's denied, depression will actually get worse and worse. And so the person who feels this way starts sinking. And it could be strung out for years, strung out for months, days, whatever. It's not an overnight thing, but the longer it goes unaddressed, the worse the person gets. And they can get so bad that you have thoughts of suicide, you have thoughts of not functioning, can't get out of bed, want to die, all that stuff. So that's when you know the person's sinking and sinking and sinking. And so again, a lot of people just don't address it, and they continue to sink. Well, anyway, let's try to understand depression a little bit. Depression is typically defined as a prolonged emotional, hopeless emotion. They feel there's no way out. They can feel chaotic. They can feel that all around them's crumbling. The whole world is crumbling. Sky is falling type of mentality. And it can affect, their outlook on life, and affects their moods, obviously, because of this. And, these normal moods of whether people are sad or grief or happy, those kinds of things get exacerbated, and they get worse. So if someone's in grief, it goes well beyond that. They get really grief-stricken to the point they can't get out of bed or whatever, or their sadness ends up being to where they can't even function in life anymore because they're so sad. And so again, all these emotions and moods progress into how they're mentally and thinking about life, thinking about reality, thinking about themselves, thinking about God. And a lot of them get to the point where they believe God can't help them, the church can't help them, counselors can't help them, and they only see one way out of it, and typically it's suicide a lot of times. But anyway, what are the symptoms of depression? And we want to talk a little bit about that and understanding, hey, maybe I do have depression and I'm just not aware of it. Well, like I said about sadness or emptiness, it goes beyond just regular sadness. It goes beyond just feeling empty for a day or two. It's deep, and it's prolonged for a period of time, and the person simply can't get out of the sadness. They can't get out of feeling empty or hopeless. And so if you've noticed yourself, say, why am I always sad every day I wake up? Why do I always feel empty every day? Well, it could be a sign of depression. Or another issue is being overwhelmed, which causes a lot of anxiety. The person is having all kinds of things hit them in life, and they simply don't know how to manage that, and so they become hopeless. because of the chaos going on around them. There's just a lot of issues they're dealing with. And so every day, they don't even know where to begin. They don't even know where to start. How do I tackle all these issues because they're all hitting me at once? And basically, they stop doing anything. They freeze up. Well, that could be a sign of depression as well, is because the person feels overwhelmed and it's causing anxiety. And that could be a sign of depression as well, because that will affect a lot of times how they concentrate. They can't concentrate anymore. They can't focus, and they can't make decisions. So if you notice yourself having the lack of ability to concentrate or make decisions, and you're like zoned out, and you're sitting there and you're stuck, that's a good sign of it. Or other signs is the person is totally apathetic to life and everything. They've lost interest in their hobbies and things they used to like to do. They don't take pleasure in anymore. And there's really nothing they like to do anymore in life. You know, before they used to like to have a hobby or they go out to eat with friends or whatever. That doesn't interest them anymore. In fact, they don't want to do anything. So they go home and they sit there in front of a TV and they do nothing. And they're apathetic about life. They don't care anymore. That's a good sign of depression. Or another sign is agitation and restlessness. They don't know what to do with themselves. They're bored or whatever. They can't figure out a direction in life, or where to go, where to head. And so they can get one of two things. They can get inactive and just do nothing. And we've seen a lot of teenagers, by the way, during this period of time, because of the shutdown, become inactive. They just don't want to do anything. They don't want to go play with friends. They just want to sit in front of a video game and play video games for hours and hours and hours. That could be a sign of depression. Or the opposite is they can get into hardcore physical hyperactivity, and they just can't rest. They can't sit down, and you see this a lot of times in adults, that they're just constantly on the move, constantly moving from one thing to the next. They'll clean their house 3 times. They'll go do this, go do that, and they're constantly moving. Well, that's coming because typically they're agitated and restless, and they're trying to fill that restlessness up with physical activity. But really, it's a sign of depression. They don't want to face that they're feeling this way, so they just get real active, get moving, they get doing something, and that's not a good place to be. A lot of people become so active, and I understand it. It's to prevent them from thinking about their situation. It's to prevent them from thinking about processing things correctly that's going on in their life. So they'll be the busiest people in the world, and people will see it and they say, "Well, that guy's always full of activity." But from a counseling standpoint, what you'll see is they're trying to escape something. They're trying to escape typically depression and how they feel about life through hyperactivity. Anyway, a lot of times people who are depressed will have sleep disturbances. They can't sleep. They have insomnia. They can sleep for maybe a couple hours, but then they're back up and woke up, and what they notice is they can't shut their brains off. The brain's constantly thinking, anxiety related, trying to solve problems and things of that nature. So they just can't rest mentally. So that keeps them up. And they start having sleep problems. If you're having sleep disturbances in all of this, it could be a sign. The other thing that you start seeing with depressed people is they have weight problems, whether anorexia or overweight, or they have a lot of appetite disturbances. So you can go one of two extremes. Don't eat is a good sign of it, and extreme weight loss, extreme weight gain in a very rapid period of time. And so when you see these big fluctuations in a person's weight, then you know there's probably something going on. Again, it doesn't explain everybody's weight loss or weight gain. But if you know what's happening in the person, let's say they had a death in the family or they lost their job and all of a sudden they put on 40 pounds, that's typically a good sign that something's going on, that they've put on an extreme amount of weight because they're depressed. Now, the funny thing about it is a lot of people going through this coronavirus have put on a lot of weight. because they are depressed. They haven't been able to go to work and go to school. And so they talk about the coronavirus 20 pounds. And it's true. A lot of people have put on extra weight because of depression that's going on during this period of time. So you got to watch that. Or they get ultra skinny. They just don't eat. When you start seeing people's bones stick out, and they're not necessarily muscular, it's not like they're working out, but you start seeing bones start sticking out, that's probably a sign that something's going on. Other things. Feelings of excessive guilt or self-reproach, or they feel worthless. And they're guilty for the things they've done. They feel, how could I do this? They're ashamed of themselves. People have made them feel worthless. They have thought that they're worthless. And so what's the point? What's the point of going on? Damaged goods, my life is messed up. It'll never be the same again. And so, I messed up my life. I did all these stupid things. And so I'm worthless. Well, see, you can easily see how that will lead eventually, if it keeps going, to forms of hardcore depression and eventually suicide from that. And that's what starts it. I'm worthless, I'm no good, or whatever. And so be careful with that. Feelings of fatigue, loss of energy. Now, everyone has fatigue and loss of energy, but do you have that every day? And every day you don't feel like getting out of bed. Every day you are tapped out of energy. Well, a lot of times your energy is being used to combat the stressing that you're undergoing and the anxiety that you're undergoing, and a lot of your emotional energy is going to that. So of course you're going to feel fatigued and have a loss of energy. So if you have this for a long period of time, it could be a sign of depression. The last thing I want to point out is obviously starting to have morbid thoughts about death or suicide. So when someone starts having these ideas of death and they're focusing on a lot of that and getting very morbid about that, or they're thinking about killing themselves or wishing that they would die, then that's probably a sign of depression. And again, I'll point you to some of the biblical characters. The biblical characters had the same thing. Like Moses, I said before, he wanted God to kill him. He wanted to die. Well, that's a morbid thought of suicide, a morbid thought of death. I want God to kill me now. I'm done. And I've heard a lot of people tell me that. They say, Brandon, I just wish God would take me home right now. And there's no reason for them to say that. It's not like they have terminal cancer or anything like that. They just don't like life. And they're tired of it. And they say, I just wish I could just go to sleep and not wake up. Well, that's depression. That's depression. Especially when they have other things to live for. That's depression. So let's do a diagnosis, so to speak. Again, I'm not a doctor, but I am a counselor. But again, I'm not saying that any of these things might trigger you to be, as far as a depressed person. I'm just saying, if you've been battling this for a long time and you've had these things, it's a good idea to go talk to somebody. Go talk to a professional. Go talk to your doctor and saying, hey man, I feel these thoughts of suicide, or I feel hopeless and I don't feel there's any way out of my situation. And you've been feeling that for a long time. It's a good idea to go get checked out. And that's what we want to push you towards. Not do your own diagnosis, but if you're having some of these symptoms, then maybe go get checked out. Maybe it's not. But it's worth taking a look at, because if you're having something happen to you, that means your chemistry's off. That means your thinking's off. You're not processing things correctly, and you need help. You need help for someone to navigate you through this. I've read somewhere that they say if a person experiences at least 5 of these symptoms for a month, they could have major depression. Other people say mild depression would typically be defined as having 2 or 4 of these symptoms over a month. And then you go into all kinds of other things like bipolar disorder, like manic depression, in which you have these major swings, from depressed moods to manic moods, where the manic moods where the person's irritable, hostile, inflated thoughts of themselves and start boasting, and they just have these wild mood swings. That's a sign of that. A good sign, you can ask yourself this to test yourself. When people are asked, what brings you pleasure in life? Most people who are in this state will say nothing. Nothing brings me pleasure in life. I don't get any pleasure out of anything in life. How about your grandkids or your kids? No. How about your work? No. How about going to church? No. Even, I'm talking about Christians. Saved people sometimes will guard that response, and they'll spiritualize it, and you know it's not true, but they'll say, well, the thing that brings me pleasure in life is that I'm saved, or I know Jesus, which is true in most parts, but a lot of times that's just a cover up for really how they're feeling. They really don't feel that way. They don't care because they want to die. And so, they may know of their eternal rewards and heavenly blessings, but they don't feel thankful about that. They don't care. Right now, they feel trapped, and they can't get out of the emotions they feel and their moods, and it affects how they even look at it spiritually. That's why they don't have any motivation typically to go to church or a Bible study, to read their Bible, or to pray. Again, they may talk a good game, but you got to look at their actions. And in their actions, they're telling you, I just don't care anymore. I don't care. And that's when you know there's problems going on. Let me give a couple biblical occurrences, biblical scriptures where you see depression being addressed. The first one you can look at is Proverbs 15:13, and that says, a merry heart makes a cheerful countenance, but by sorrow of the heart the spirit is broken. So in a lot of ways, sorrow of the heart, it breaks the spirit. And that's a good way in the ancient world to talk about depression, is a broken heart, a broken spirit. Okay? That's what the Bible is trying to say. So when you see it addressed in Proverbs like that, and Proverbs are, when you interpret Proverbs, they're general truths. Okay? They're generalities. And so what it's basically saying about a broken spirit, sorrow of the heart, is that it's a condition that's a universal problem for human beings. And again, they didn't call it depression, but they call it broken spirit or a broken heart. And that's how their terminology that they used. So you think about, for instance, like the character David. David was extremely overwhelmed with grief and sadness for a lot of the things he did and a lot of the things other people did. And his heart was desolate. He talks about his tears falling at night. And a lot of times David will say, I'm cast. And the idea of being cast is the idea of a sheep that has so much wool that it trips and falls over and gets on its back. And because the wool is so heavy, the sheep can't right himself. He can't get back up. He's stuck on his back. And that's a good way of describing depression, that David would say, my soul is cast down. I'm cast. And again, using agrarian terms, we would say, well, that's a depressed state, because he would say, I'm in a state on my back and I can't right myself. I can't get out of the situation I'm in, the grief and the sadness, and so I'm on my back. I need someone to come and help me get turned back onto my feet, is what he was trying to express. And so the biblical characters would express rejection. I mean, David had a lot of rejection, loneliness, a lot of self-pity, hopelessness, overwhelmed by grief. And a lot of them said, I wish I hadn't been born. I mean, that's depression right there. And again, they're not talking about, just temporary sadness. These are classical symptoms that the biblical characters are talking about of depression. Another example of that is Hannah in 1 Samuel 1. She had many symptoms of depression if you look at the text. But her spiritual leader in that situation incorrectly accused her of having a spiritual problem. And so you can see all of this happening in the scriptures, just like it's happening today to a lot of believers. And so unfortunately, if someone admits in Christian circles that they have depression, unfortunately, there's a lot of theologies that will actually shame them for feeling this way. And they'll say, well, you shouldn't feel that way, and you just need to get right with God, and you need to get over it, and just pick yourself up and move on. And when you hear that, that's someone who's ignorant, theologically ignorant, relationally ignorant, and typically it's their theology that's driving that. They see the world in black and white, and they say, well, if you're saved, you wouldn't have depression. That's baloney. A lot of believers are in depression, a lot of them. And so unfortunately, you have these weird theologies that these pastors and counselors try to push on people, and all it does, it makes it worse. It makes it worse. They don't help the person. They shame them. They guilt them for feeling that way. And so unfortunately, the Christian church hasn't done very well in helping people through this. It's not easy. In fact, sometimes it's a part of the brain that needs help. Sometimes it's a chemistry issue. So it's a biological thing, not necessarily a spiritual thing. Yes, can depression be brought on by not thinking correctly and not perceiving reality correctly from a biblical standpoint? Yes. But it also sometimes is a medical issue, and that needs to be addressed. The funny thing about this is that typically they find in studies that older Christians have more depression than younger. There's no doubt younger people can get depressed, and we're seeing a lot of that right now. But older people have a lot of depression. It just never comes out. They never talk about it. And again, I want you to think about that. Older people getting depression. Well, so what that indicates is that older Christians who are more mature typically in the faith are still having problems. So you would think, well, the youth would be more depressed because, well, of all the stresses of life and the lack of biblical understanding. But yet it's the older people that have more depression. And yet they have more biblical truth behind them, more spiritual maturity than someone's young. Why is that happening? And again, is it a consequence sometimes of age? Could be. There's, brain problems. There's less chemicals being secreted out. But nonetheless, a lot of older people are depressed because they look back in life, they see the way life went, and they don't like it. They don't appreciate what happened to them. They wish their life could have been in a different direction. They wish things could have played out differently. And so typically older people have a hard time with depression because they live with a lot of regrets, a lot of failures, and they won't process that from a biblical perspective. And hence it just haunts them and haunts them and haunts them. And you ever talk to somebody that's a senior saint and they're just grouchy and cynical and kind of mean-spirited and nothing makes them happy? That's depression. And I guarantee you sometimes they're looking back at their life saying, I wish my life would have went a different way. What they really need to do is go talk to a counselor. What they really need to do is get checked out by a medical doctor as well, because it could be a chemistry issue. But a lot of times it's just they don't process things correctly. More women, 2 to 3 times have depression than men. I'm not saying men don't get depressed, they do, but women typically have more depression than men. And that's just sometimes a fact of life. Maybe it's their hormones. Maybe it's their chemistry. Who knows? A lot of women who are having hormone problems end up depressed, and they don't know why. And so a lot of them have to go into getting some help with their bodies to get back up to normal. But a lot of times they'll just go and continue to roll like that and not realize, I got to go see a doctor. There's something wrong with me. And so they just go, and what happens is it destroys their family. It destroys their marriage because they're in a depression that they're not aware of, and so they're irritable, hard to get along with, mean-spirited, and fatigued and tired and whatnot, and so that comes out on their marriage and it comes out on the kids. And so because that's not being addressed, the person just keeps getting worse and worse, and a lot of times it ends in divorce because the people can't take it anymore. They can't, those around them just simply can't take the kind of moods that the person's always in. Radical mood swings, you're walking on eggshells around them, and people just can't live like that. But the problem could be easily solved if they just went to the doctor and got tested. Or they met with a professional counselor. But they won't. For some reason, they don't. And I don't understand that. I don't understand when all the help is available and they don't do that. I don't get that. So with women, what they notice about women is women tend to take events that are happening in their life that are adverse to them, that's causing confusion, causing all the chaos in their life, and then they internalize them, and then they take blame for it. So basically, a lot of women have a thought processing problem. They just internalize it, feel guilty, and they just start sinking. Men, on the other hand, tend to react to, problems in life with trying to escape from them. Men will go into sports, hobbies, TV, sexual obsessions, obviously, alcohol, whatever they can do to escape the feeling that they're feeling, that they can't handle this or whatnot. And so you can see women internalize it, men escape. And that's a common thing about people, about handling this. But unfortunately, it leads into other problems. It starts affecting them physically. And I find it interesting that when they start having depression, their physical bodies start breaking down. They start getting viruses because their immune system starts going down. They start getting colds, and they start having hypertension. They start having issues with diabetes all of a sudden. Parts of them start breaking down. And so typically, if I'm counseling somebody, I ask them what's going on in life, and then inevitably they'll tell me there's all the other physical things breaking down as well. And typically, if that's happening, they're correlated. Not all the time, but typically they are, and that they start breaking down physically because of all the stress and depression they're under. And again, a difference between a man and a woman will tend to feel their depression while men acted out in their behavior through anger, hostility, and frustration. So basically, if you're in a home, the woman will be sad and guilt-ridden, and the men will be angry, hostile, and frustrated with life. So when you see both of those aspects, then you know there's some depression going on here in both partners or just one of them. Anyway, that's what we'll wrap up today. I'm going to continue this discussion on depression, but I wanted to give you some points to think about. And again, if you feel this way, you've got to go see a counselor, a pastor, a therapist, and you got to go see your medical doctor as well to make sure it's not a chemistry problem, okay? So again, we'll continue this talk next time. Thanks for watching, and let's try to diagnose whether or not we're in depression, okay? Because we want to be free from that. We don't want that hurting our lives, hurting our marriage, hurting our parenting, and because we got a lot of stuff coming forward to us in the days ahead, and we need to be ready for that, and we don't need to be in a depressed state. Anyway, we'll see you next time, okay?